Hello again. This video is going to talk about how to build arguments for persuasive speeches. So a few things we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about 5 different ways that you can build arguments in persuasive speeches. Those are going to be by example, by analogy, through cause and effect relationships, by deduction, and by authority. So let's start out with examples. When you're arguing by examples, what you're doing is you're actually using something called inductive reasoning. And when you're using inductive reasoning, basically what you're doing is you're saying that there are a few examples of this truth, whatever you're saying it is, and that these few examples can be generalized to the larger population. Okay? I always think of inductive reasoning, I remember it versus deductive reasoning by thinking about induction, inducing throw up, like the pumpkin that's vomiting there. Something starts at your mouth, there's just a little bit of it, and then it goes everywhere, right? So that's how you can remember inductive reasoning. So, for example, if you were trying to make the argument that healthy babies come from moms who exercise 30 minutes a day every day of the pregnancy, you might say that in this case, this was true, and in this case, this was true, and in this case, this was true. An example of this mom was true, an example of this mom was true. So we can say that based on these few examples that are right here, we can generalize this to the larger population that all moms should try to exercise 30 minutes a day when they're pregnant to have healthy babies. Okay? When we're arguing by example, there's a few things we need to consider, however. First off, we need to consider if the examples are actually true, because if they're not, we don't want to use those in our speeches. That'll really hurt our credibility, especially if our audience members know that it's not true. For example, if you were trying to argue that we don't need to vaccinate our children, you wouldn't want to use the study that has come out and said, yes, I was lying when I said that vaccinating our children is a bad thing. See, a lot of audience members might know that, but they know it's not true, and that's not going to be a good example then. You also want to consider if your example is going to be relevant or not. So think about that. Think it through. Does this example actually bring up what you're trying to say? If you're telling a story about someone being kind to someone else, you need to think about, is that going to be relevant to your speech on random acts of kindness or something along those lines? You also need to consider if your example is going to be sufficient enough to be able to make the claim. If you give 2 or 3 examples of something and it's a big, strong, kind of controversial claim that you're making, you need to make sure you're giving enough examples to make sure your audience will actually believe the argument you're making. And then finally, you need to consider if your examples are actually representative. Are you talking about examples of individual cases that are true of the larger general population that you're talking about, or are you giving examples that are really only kind of isolated incidents? Those are all going to impact how strong those are going to help you. Those examples will help you build your arguments. Another way that you can build arguments is through analogy. And this one's a little bit more confusing, but it can be a really useful way to build some of those arguments. And basically, when you're arguing by analogy, what you're doing is you're comparing 2 different things that share certain characteristics. So if you've seen the Muppet movie, the most recent Muppet movie recently, you'll know that Jason Segel has a Muppet that is he's comparing himself to. He's comparing himself, am I a man or am I a Muppet? And if you're looking at the picture in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, you can see that there are some similarities between Jason Segel and the Muppet. They both have about the same color hair, they have the same face shape, they have the same eyes, they both like to sing, that type of thing. They're both performers, right? So they share several different characteristics. So what you'd want to do then is, if you're making that analogy and you're trying to argue something about one of them, you'd say, since they share characteristics A, B, C, and D, we can also believe that characteristic E, F, or G is also going to be true. Because they're so similar, we can share that this would be the same way. So, for instance, if you were trying to argue something, a policy change, for instance, in the United States, and you found out that another country had already enacted that policy, you might say, well, in England and the United States have these similarities, A, B, C, D, E, whatever. And England was able to enact this policy successfully, and this was its outcome. So, since England and the United States are so similar, we should be able to see the same types of positive outcomes if we would enact this policy as well, okay? The thing you want to think about when you're arguing by analogy is you want to consider if the similarities and if the differences are actually relevant, okay? Obviously, if you're looking at the picture of Jason Segel and the Muppet again, some of those similarities are relevant. They both like to perform, they both like to sing, they both are, I don't know, different things like that, right? That might be relevant if you're making the analogy to say that Muppets can be very lifelike. I don't know exactly what the argument might be. However, if you're trying to argue that the Muppet should be given the same rights as Jason Segel, as a human being, then those differences start to become important, like the fact that the Muppet does not have any actual real life going on, that it's given life by somebody else's hand being, well, in control, let's call it. So that's the kind of things you want to think about when you're arguing by analogy. When you're arguing by cause and effect, that's another way that you can build some of your arguments. Basically what you're saying is, this is the cause of this happening, and this is what happens after this cause happens, okay? So it's, you think back to that, you think back to the story of you give a mouse a cookie, all right? If you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to ask for a glass of milk, all right? So the effect is asking for a glass of milk, and the cause is giving a mouse a cookie. You need to think about, when you're using this cause and effect relationship, does that relationship actually exist? If you give a mouse a cookie, is it really going to ask for a glass of milk? Is that the only time that the mouse would ask for a glass of milk? Obviously we're being a little bit silly here because mice can't actually talk, but that's kind of some of the things you should start to think about with that. However, the cause and effect relationship can be an effective way to build your arguments. And that's kind of something that you'll see a lot when you're looking at the problem solution method of argumentation. Arguing by deduction is kind of the opposite of arguing by induction. So it's kind of, you think about it like a funnel. You start out with a broad generalization, and you say that this generalization is true of all individual instances. Okay? So you will look at, for instance, let's talk about print media. You might say print media is dying. It's a dying art form, right? Newspaper sales are down across the board, right? So if you're making this broad generalization, then what you're using when you're arguing by deduction, then you're going to a specific instance. You might say newsprint is dead. Thus, the Chattanooga Times is also a newspaper that's going to be dead because it's true of the larger group of everything. Therefore, it must also be true of the individual instances. Arguing by deduction can be a good thing to do if you're arguing, for instance, about homelessness in the United States. You might say, homelessness in the United States is caused by this, 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 and this. So, therefore, we can deduce that that's probably also going to be true of homelessness in Calhoun. So that can be a useful thing to do. But we do need to consider with arguing by deduction, is this actually true of all individuals? And I think that there are some instances that we could think of, things like, for instance, the first thing that always comes to my mind when I think about arguing by deduction and being careful with it is racism. If we make an overarching statement about a group of people, that may not be true of all individuals. And especially, I think about when people make generalizations about me, and I don't like that. So we don't want to make untrue generalizations about others then, instead. The last type of way that we can build an argument in a persuasive speech is by authority. And I think this is the one that we usually go to first. We think, okay, I'm going to go online and I'm going to find somebody else's statistics or find something else that says that this is true. And that's just fine. Authority is a good way to build arguments because we honestly can't say that we are the end-all be-all of information about all of our topics, right? That makes sense. So we appeal to somebody else's authority and we say, this person is an expert, and because they are an expert and they say it's true, then this is proving my claims as to why this is true, right? Some of the things we need to consider when we're arguing by authority, however, is this person actually an expert? And is this person an expert about this topic? I think that if you were talking about persuasive speaking or speaking in general, public speaking in general, you could probably consider me to be an expert. However, like we've talked about before, I would not be an expert to give a speech about how to remove somebody's appendix. That's not something I'm an expert on. So make sure that the expert that you're seeking is actually an expert on this topic. Just because Donald Trump says something doesn't mean that he's giving an expert opinion about it. If it's something about business, perhaps he would be an expert about it. If he's giving something about fashion sense or how to cut your hair, not sure that I would agree with him being considered an expert. Finally, you want to think about when you're arguing by authority that your source, is that source biased or unbiased? Now, I would argue that you can't have an unbiased source, which we'll talk about more when we get into research. However, you do want to think about, if your source is biased, how is that going to impact the way that you're going to be using that information? So, some of these things you want to think about as you're trying to build these different arguments in your persuasive speeches. You want to utilize several different ways to build your arguments, because that's going to be the most effective way to engage your audience in what you're trying to say. Hope this has been helpful.